Thank you for having me today and giving me a little bit of your time this afternoon. As Alistair mentioned, I work in a department called People Analytics at Google. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to use data to make HR decisions in particular, and hopefully convince you that this is not a crazy notion, but tell you how we go about it and a couple of stories about how we've done it. And then take some of your questions as well. So these are the three questions I'm hoping that you will have answers to by the end of this talk. First, what is people analytics? Secondly, what is the analytic value chain? So in human speak, this is how do you make decisions based on HR data? And then, like I said, I'll give you a couple of examples, a few case studies and stories about how we've used data to make HR decisions over the past couple of years. All right, so before we dive in, it's helpful to know a little bit about our history and our culture to help you understand how we got to where we are today. So as of today, we have about 28,000 Googlers or employees and across 60 companies, many different continents, obviously, 30 different countries, 60 offices, 30 countries. But as many of you probably know, we started as a small tech startup founded by 2 engineers. And as we all know, engineers love data, right? And so from the very beginning, in order to have a seat at the table, in order to speak the language, convince people, drive action, every area of the company had to speak the language of data. And that was no different for HR. And so Google's culture in this way, I think, has maybe predated where everyone is kind of moving now in this era of big data. You have to be able to speak the language of data and convince people using data in order to have an impact. And so that's one element of our culture that has really shaped how the HR organization at Google has evolved. But secondly, some of you may remember that when Google IPO'd in 2004, this was the beginning of the letter that the founders sent out. So it started with, Google is not a conventional company, and we do not intend to become one. And this has really pervaded everything that we've done at Google, including HR. So just because a lot of HR organizations haven't historically used a lot of data to make decisions and drive action, that didn't matter to them. Every area of the business at Google was pushed and expected to make use of data in their daily operations, and that was no different for HR. And so these two things coming together, kind of an engineering company and also this kind of healthy appreciation for the unconventional, really formed how the HR department at Google has evolved over the years. Okay, so our first question for today, what is people analytics? So let's see if you can read my director's scrawl here. This is the mission of our department, that all people decisions at Google are made based on data and analytics. And so the group that I'm a part of has about 30 people. We're composed of 3 kind of different types. So we have about 1/3 PhDs in psychology, organizational behavior, sociology, behavioral economics, these kinds of social science disciplines. We have about 1/3 MBAs who focused on human capital, different kinds of HR topics within their MBA programs. And then we have about 1/3 who have come from all over but are just experts in data mining. So using kind of emerging or advanced tools to mine the data that we have. And so this is our mission. We try to make sure that all of the people decisions, whether that be, focused on compensation, talent management, staffing, the HR business partners who support different areas of the business, any of the decisions that are made in any of these realms, we try to put data toward. So how seriously do we actually take this? So a little deviation, again, back toward Google's culture. How many of you know that Google is a little bit of a sticker culture? Do you know what that means? We put stickers on our computers. It's really kind of a bizarre thing. Yeah. Okay, we have an example right here. So then you may remember that this is one example. Whenever there's a popular Google Doodle that comes out, they make a sticker of it, people put it on their computer. Or sometimes when you're working for a particular project or product that you're very proud of, you get a sticker made and you put on your computer. So how seriously do we in People Analytics take our data? When people start in our group, they get this sticker. And just goes to show, we take ourselves pretty seriously. But in reality, okay, more seriously, I like to look at our structure in the HR world to show how seriously this is taken not just by us, but also the head of HR and the rest of the business. So this is how the HR organization is organized at Google. And so the middle hub is our head of HR, Laszlo Bach. And then each of these different HR functions reports directly into Laszlo. And analytics reports directly to the head of HR, to Laszlo. This is a pretty unique thing in the HR world. Usually, if there is an analytics function, it will report into one of these other functions. And so this is just one indicator of how seriously Google takes data within HR. But the other kind of indicator of that within HR's structure is that there's one person within our analytics department dedicated to each of these different functions. So, for example, we call them points of contact. So a talent point of contact, benefits point of contact, someone dedicated to engineering, tech, sales, et cetera. And so every single one of these functions is expected to make their decisions related to HR based on data. So we do really take it seriously despite the sticker spoofing. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a sense for what people analytics is. So I'm going to quickly go through what we call the analytic value chain, which is how we actually make decisions based on data. And I'm hoping that you guys can take this away and use this in your own organizations as well. So we generally start with what we refer to as opinion. And this is how a lot of people think HR organizations are run. Whether or not that is the case is kind of up to you guys and what you see. But opinion, as you all know, is based on your gut feel, your experience. People just saying, well, I just know this is true because I've seen it happen for years and this is just how it is. So this is where you don't want to be, right? This is why analytics departments exist, so that you can move kind of beyond people's opinions. So next, you have data, and all HR groups basically have a ton of data, right? Who's in the organization? How many people get promoted? What percentage of the people are leaving the company? HR and data are not inherently working against each other. There's been data in HR forever, right? But data in and of itself is not really very easily digested. So if I gave you a list of everyone working in your organization, who really cares? You can't really do anything with that, right? So it's raw. You have no insight coming out of, just a blank spreadsheet of data. So the next kind of move up the chain is what we refer to as metrics. Metrics are good. Generally, what this is counts or things like ratios that you might send out on a regular basis. So this is the percentage of managers that we have for every full-time employee. And these are kind of interesting. You can trend them over time, and they help give people a little bit more insight into what's happening in the company. But over time, if you're sending out dashboards of metrics again and again, people are going to get numb to them. They just expect to see it. They don't necessarily take anything new out of it. They just kind of take it for granted. And I don't want to underestimate the importance of metrics. You have to kind of start here, right? You have to have some sort of understanding of what's happening in your organization. But that doesn't help you make decisions or drive action. This just helps to get to know kind of who's there, what's happening. So the next thing you want to do is start to analyze. And this is where we like to play. This is where you want to be. And this is where you can start to look at the different data that you have and draw connections between your data. So what are the relationships between X and Y? And I'll give you a couple of examples in the next few minutes about how we've analyzed some of our data and gotten some kind of cool insights out of it. But this is kind of moving in the right direction. And then the last two are kind of the pinnacle. You take your analysis, you draw out an insight, and then you push it to drive action in the company. And so that's kind of the process that we follow as we're trying to make a decision, test a hypothesis, and move from just an opinion or a myth, a rumor, et cetera, down toward action and trying to really change and improve the company. So this is what it actually is, if you think about it kind of more holistically. It's a little bit of witchcraft sometimes. Okay. All right, so I'm going to tell you three kind of different stories, different case studies about how we've used data to drive decision-making and action over the past couple of years. The first one is related to our people managers, and it's called Project Oxygen. Some of you may have read about this. It's gotten a little bit of media attention lately. And before I do, just a quick side note about the group that conducted this analysis. It's called the People and Innovation Lab. It's part of the People Analytics group, but basically it's a group of social scientists focused on solving and answering longer-term questions or problems. And they tackle things that are not immediately being asked of us by the business, but questions or kind of problems that we want to get a better understanding of that require a lot more time or in-depth analysis. And so their mission is to conduct innovative research that transforms our practice, both within Google and beyond. So they actually frequently partner with academic researchers from universities, which is pretty cool, a little bit unusual. And so what Project Oxygen was all about was going back to a myth that was kind of started at the early days of Google. And again, thinking about an engineering company, you guys probably know that being a people manager in a tech company is not exactly the most high status job, right? People don't necessarily want to end up there. It's not exactly the most hardcore technical role that you could have. And so little known fact is that back in the early days of Google, the founders said, we don't really understand what these managers are doing for us. Do we even need managers? Let's just get rid of them. And so they actually just got rid of them. And they made everybody an individual contributor again. And as you can imagine, this did not necessarily work out too well, and so the managers came back. But a stigma remained that managers really weren't doing that much. There was no proven impact of managers at the company. And so the Pi Lab took on this project. They said, okay, well, let's see. Do managers actually make an impact here? And so the first thing they did was look at data sources that already existed. And so these are two things that I think most companies will have: performance reviews of employees and an employee survey. And so they looked at these two things because it gave two different signals. The performance review is the review of the manager from a top-down approach. And the employee survey looks at the manager and reviews them from the bottom up, right? So it's their own direct reports reviewing them. And so what the Pi Lab did is they plotted these two scores, one on the x-axis, one on the y, and they looked at where managers fell in this plot. And at first glance, people were pretty tightly clustered. It looked like people were doing pretty well, actually. So that was good news, but it didn't help us answer the question, do managers actually matter? And so what they did next was they cut the data into the top quartile and the bottom quartile. And they looked at the best, if you will, managers and the worst managers. And then they looked at how these managers performed based on their teams in terms of team productivity, how happy their employees were, how likely the employees were to stay with the company, and other things. And the results were astounding. So even though there was this tightly clustered bunch, there were huge differences in the manager's impact on these kinds of things. And through regression analysis, you guys probably know you're able to parse out the effects. And so it was really pretty startling for people to see that, okay, managers actually do seem to be having an impact on things that we care about. And so I guess the Pi Lab at that point said, all right, we've kind of proven our point, managers matter, but we don't want to stop there. We don't want to just make this an academic exercise, right? We want to actually help managers who are struggling get better. We're not going to get rid of the managers, right? We want to help them improve. But they had no idea how managers got to be good. I mean, they could have looked into the management literature, but at Google, local norms tend to trump best practices from outside. They've never said that what's been done before is good enough for us to do now. And so they had the Pi Lab look into what makes a good manager here. And so the next thing that they did was two different qualitative studies. First, they started doing an award called the Great Manager Award. And in order to nominate someone for the award, you had to write up examples of behaviors that they had done that you believe qualified them to win the Great Manager Award. And so what the PyLab did was scientifically study the write-ups. They coded them to find out what were common examples of things that great managers did. And then simultaneously what they did was a double-blind interview study where they interviewed both great and not as great managers, and neither the manager nor the interviewer knew which pocket they were in. And then they coded these transcripts as well to better understand what were the common kinds of things that the great managers were doing compared to the kinds of things that the not as great managers were doing. And so based on this, they came up with 8 behaviors that our best managers generally did, and 3 what they called pitfalls for things that our struggling managers fell into. So in case you're curious, here are the 8. Most people's reaction to this list is, yeah, we kind of knew that. This isn't earth-shattering. This isn't particularly non-obvious, right? But I think the idea is if I polled the room right now, we'd probably come up with 20 to 30 behaviors that great managers do. And the reality is that we know these are the 8 top ones that Google managers do. And that was really powerful. And then these were the 3 things that were most common amongst managers who were struggling. So they had a tough transition, they lacked a consistent philosophy, they didn't spend enough time on managing and communicating. So that was interesting, right? We can do something with that. And so what we did after that was we started measuring people on this. So we know that these are the kinds of things that help people become a great manager at Google. Okay, well, let's find out how people are doing. So we started implementing twice yearly upward feedback surveys. And everybody's direct reports rate their managers twice a year, and the managers get the results and are held to an expectation that they will take action to improve. We've continued to do the Great Manager Award as well to recognize people who do it particularly well. But we've also redesigned manager training programs and also put together new communications plans to basically let people know what they're being judged on and also what are some best practices that managers at Google do in order to improve on these kinds of things. So let's go back to our value chain. So we had the opinion. Managers don't impact Googler performance. They don't matter, right? We had data. We knew that we had thousands of managers at Google. That didn't mean we were going to keep them just because they existed. We didn't know that because we hadn't always kept them for that reason, right? And so we knew that we had data. We even had metrics. We knew that most Googlers were pretty happy with their managers. Remember I said there was a pretty tightly clustered group. We knew that they were doing pretty well. But then we went into the analysis, and this is where it really got fun. So this is when we found out that good managers, our best managers, had a very statistically significantly better impact on things that we care about than our worst managers. And then we moved into insight. Here are the 8 things that great managers do and the 3 pitfalls that our most struggling managers fall into. And here's how we can train people then to keep improving across the board. And so that's kind of how we moved up the value chain for people managers. So I thought I would give just a couple of other examples of how we've done this with some other kinds of HRE-related problems, separate from employee effectiveness. But another one that a lot of people in HR think about quite a bit is structure, right? So how do you want your organization to look? How should it be defined? And you guys know that Google has grown fairly substantially over the years. And for a while, we were hiring and promoting pretty quickly. And one of the things people were wondering about was, what is our organization going to look like if we keep hiring and promoting at this rate? And so this was a totally different type of analysis. What we did here was we developed a tool called the org planning tool, and it is a simulation that basically looks at the rates that we have now of hiring, promotions, attrition, these kinds of things, feeds it in, and it can tell you how the organization will look over time if those things stay constant. And so you can look at it this way. So on all the way to the left, you see hypothetical current state. This is our organization or one business unit and all the different levels. So you start at the bottom with our lowest level employees and all the way up to the top. And so you can see it's kind of a fat middle, right? And looking at kind of the rates of promotion and attrition and hiring that we had at the time, there were 3 scenarios that were mapped out. The first scenario was kind of status quo. If we don't do anything, this is how the organization is going to start to look, right? People will move up, we'll get fatter in the middle, and there will be not much of a career path for people who come in at the low levels, right? Because we'll be really fat in the middle. So scenario B was, okay, what if we reduce the promo rates? We backfill, instead of backfilling people who leave at the level where they left, backfill below. That's another option. So then we kind of have less kind of width in the middle, but it's a little bit of an inverted pyramid, right? And then scenario C is, let's try reducing our promo rates, but backfilling a little bit more strategically so that we don't get this just very linear reverse pyramid. Let's try to backfill where we think we need it the most. And this is just kind of another type of analysis or type of tool that you can use to kind of, like we used the survey and interviews in the first example, another tool that you can use to use data to give insight into questions or problems that you have. And so if we think about this from the value chain again, the opinion was, there's really no downside to doing nothing. Let's just keep hiring and promoting as we've always done. The data showed that we have X number of L1 Googlers, Y number of L2, et cetera, but that was no real insight. That's just strict numbers, right? If you start to get into metrics, we could send out dashboards all we wanted. Today, the average level of a Googler is this. Tomorrow, it's going to be this. Here's kind of the rate or the average of various metrics that are involved in this kind of question. But analysis was where it got fun. Looking at the historic attrition and promotion rates, the average level is going to increase in the coming years, and we're going to have these kinds of problems, right? So our insight here was, if we backfill attrition at level 1 or at the lower levels, we will avoid the inverted pyramid and will maintain some sort of career path for more junior folks who are coming in and otherwise might not see a lot of opportunity because there would be a really big overflow of people at the middle levels. And so what did we do? We changed our hiring strategy. And so now we backfill attrition at lower levels than where people left. And so this was another kind of way that we just moved up the value chain using data in a totally different way than the first example. Okay, one more. This one is my favorite. So how many of you are familiar with the Google Moderator tool? Okay, a fair number. So one of the things we talk a lot about in HR is the myths or the rumors that go on in an organization. All organizations have this, right? And a lot of them have to do with people or HR. And Google Moderator, we call it internally Dory, is a forum where a lot of myths are created. So we actually have a weekly employee happy hour on Fridays where this tool is used for employees to ask questions of business leaders. And they can ask anything they want, and they do. And it's very transparent, but a lot of myths are generated this way. So one, for example, historically was, we think that employees who don't work in the headquarter office don't get promoted as quickly. So inversely, employees who work in the headquarters office get promoted faster than employees who don't, which doesn't happen to be true, but this is a myth that we busted. And so I will show you kind of how this has gone down. So the reason that we care about myths in HR is that they kind of distract people, right? People focus on the myths and the rumors rather than focusing on things that the business probably wants them to focus on. And so business leaders get worried about this for this reason. And so what are some of the myths that we see? Only Ivy League grads ever get hired here. New grad hire compensation is based on the school that you went to and not based on your actual abilities. SWEs, software engineers, get promoted more than everybody else does. Or working on what we call shiny projects increases chances for promotion. So I will tell you that all of these are false, otherwise I obviously wouldn't be sharing them with you today. But these created a lot of concern for people, right? And so we had a whole series called Promotion Mythbusters where we tackled each one of these things. And so to do this, we take what we call a hypothesis-driven approach. And so the first step is articulating the problem you're trying to solve. And so rather than diving into the data and just trying to prove that these things are not true, articulate your problem statement. Or articulate your hypothesis. And so that's the second thing. So, for example, employees who work in Mountain View, our headquarters, get promoted more quickly than those who do not. The third step is getting the data. And so the point here is that this is step number 3, not step number 1. You want to get the data after you've articulated your hypothesis so that you're not just pulling data in from everywhere, wasting your own time trying to just get at the right answer, right? You want to really just look at a targeted set of data, quickly say yes or no, this is or this is not true. Finally, you want to conduct the right tests. Usually these aren't particularly complex tests. You're looking at different groups of people and you say, yes, this person or this group of people was promoted faster, or no, they were not. And then finally, you communicate the results. And this is actually a really key, important part of the process here. You don't necessarily want to communicate the results to everyone. You want the right people to have the results at the right time. So maybe you feed the results to business leaders right before you know they're going to go, speak to a group of people who's particularly concerned about something. Another kind of caveat is only answer the question you're trying to answer, right? Don't necessarily get up there and say, well, this hypothesis, this myth was not right. But actually, let me tell you about 10 other things that we found. Can open a huge can of worms, right? So this is the approach that we tend to take on myth busting. All right, so you could look at it this way in terms of our value chain. Opinion equals myth, insight equals myth busted. Here we had the opinion that promotions were easier for Googlers based in the headquarters. The data was that this many promotions occur annually. The metric was that the promotion rate for Mountain View-based Googlers was exactly the same as that from other offices. Looking a little deeper, we cut the data some more and found the promotion rate for Googlers in small offices outside Mountain View was different from Googlers who worked in large offices outside Mountain View. And also found that rather than just being from a different office, what was particularly important was getting senior peer feedback as part of your promotion packet. And so the action we took there was we busted the myth, but we also identified something that was actually quite important and tended to be influenced by the office where you were based. And so that's now available to people. They know that if they're going up for promotion, these are the kinds of things they should think about. So that was my third example for you. And so now we come back to our 3 questions. What is people analytics? What is the analytic value chain? And how has Google used data to influence action? And hopefully you're able to answer these questions at this point. And I'd be happy to answer any of yours, too. Thank you.
Good job. Can we have the house lights up just a little? How many people in the audience are aware of the HR systems that you're using as a company to track performance and stuff like that? How many of you do stuff like this? So a lot of you have data, but it's not widely available. Is that it? So it sounds like what Google's done is say we need to have embedded analysts in every part of the business, even HR,
Yep.
and other people have the data, they're just not analyzing it. You did, however, say that you shouldn't distribute all the data to everyone. You should find the right time when it'll do the most good without confusing things, which is in pretty stark contrast to some of the stuff that we've heard from other people saying, share it and everything will be wonderful and flowers will bloom.
Sure.
Is that because HR is such a sensitive field? Is that something special about it?
I mean, I think that sharing with everyone and 1,000 flowers will bloom is a little bit extreme no matter what, certainly. But people data is a different animal, right? It's very personal. A lot of it is controlled legally. You have to be very careful with it. And so I think being very careful is probably a wise way to go, but I think what you say is accurate.
Did you have anybody with a legal background other than HR, like lawyers come in and vet the process before you published it?
Before we published any of these kinds of things?
Yeah, did you have someone in your analyst firm, because you're in a high sensitivity thing, do you
Yeah.
need to embed not only an analyst but a lawyer?
Yes. So everything that we do, if we're speaking publicly, for sure, is reviewed by
But
lawyers.
even within Google,
yes,
just collecting that data.
Internally as well. Before we conduct many analyses, we actually have to consult with lawyers.
What kind of steps, even before you can crunch the
Yeah.
numbers, what kind of steps did you take to anonymize the data? Did you have to, or was it?
Most of our data is not anonymous. So
Right.
in order to track people over time, you have to be able to link people to their data. That being said, we do everything with strict confidentiality. And so while it's not necessarily not tied to your name, it is treated with the utmost data security.
And so if I'm an employee at Google, you have these statistics on me. Do I have the right to access my own records? I mean, how transparent is that?
Good question. So if an employee would contact us about that, most of the data that we have, they already know. So things like manager effectiveness survey, the upward feedback survey that I spoke about, all of those results are shared with managers. Annual employee survey, all of them are shared with managers. They know their performance scores. A lot of these things are already shared. And so I think that in general, employees would feel like it's a pretty transparent process.
So Google has replaced some pretty mainstream business practices, the whole IPO auction model. I mean, lots of things like that. Primarily because it was started by a bunch of guys who have a very different headset on what the world should look like rather than doing it the way it's supposed to be. Is it going to take a head of HR who grew up using Facebook before regular companies adopt this, or do you think they're just going to be pressured into more data-driven models anyway?
I think there already is pressure. I mean, more and more companies are hiring PhDs to do these kinds of things rather than traditional folks with HR backgrounds. I think data is permeating everything, as evidenced by this conference. So I don't think it takes somebody with a really unconventional mindset anymore. I think this is already more the expectation, and it's just that not a lot of companies have caught up.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.